Last time we looked at the industrialization of the United States in the late 19th century, including the rise of big business, as exemplified especially by Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. And we also looked briefly at the rise of big labor, the organized labor movement. The other two major processes involved in the emergence of modern America in the late 19th century, in addition to industrialization, were urbanization and immigration. Of course, neither of these were new phenomena. There had been cities since colonial times, and of course, unless you're a full-blooded Native American, everybody in the United States is the product of immigration. What was new, as with industrialization, was the incredibly rapid pace of urbanization and immigration. As far as the urbanization of the United States was concerned, what you see in the late 19th century, and this was directly tied, for the most part, to industrialization, is the rapid growth both in the total number of urban areas, but also in the size of many cities in the United States, led, of course, by New York and Chicago, cities that became enormous. All parts of the country participated in the urbanization process, though it was less pronounced in the South and parts of the West. What attracted people to the cities in the late 19th century? Well, most of all, that's where the better paying jobs were, and that was directly related, of course, to the rise of industry and big business. But in addition to that, the city offered many conveniences, such as electricity and all the things that made possible, that would not reach the small town or the farm for many years to come. And you could see these cities glowing in the distance once they had electric lighting. Cities also offered institutions of entertainment and culture that were not available in rural areas, amusement parks, starting with Coney Island in New York, theaters, museums, libraries, better schools and colleges for the most part, and of course, spectator sports and other new forms of entertainment. Cities in the late 19th century grew in two directions at once. They grew outward thanks to electric power, which made it possible to have the first mass transit systems. In fact, these were often referred to as streetcar suburbs. This is the beginning of suburbia. Before the auto age, which is not far off in the future at this point, a lot of people started moving out from the inner city to the leafier suburbs and commuted to work via electric trolley systems. Also, cities were growing upward as well, thanks to new techniques in steel and cable bridge building, which improved transportation, but also high-rise buildings are now possible thanks to steel frame and cast iron construction. The city of Chicago pioneered the construction of skyscrapers when it had to rebuild from the Great Fire of the early 1870s. And other cities, of course, not to be outdone by Chicago, including New York, started to build skyscrapers as well. Then, as now, of course, not everything about city life was attractive. There was crime, including gang violence, many of the gangs being ethnic in their origin. Also, of course, severely overcrowded housing, unpaved streets, terrible pollution, especially water pollution. And a lot of this was because of the limited knowledge of germs and things like that, but also the fact that many American cities were growing so rapidly that street paving could simply not keep up with street construction, and sewage disposal and treatment could not keep up with the enormous amounts of household and industrial waste. Therefore, there was also a lot of epidemic disease in American cities, and it really was not until improvements were made in water filtration and purification systems that American cities started to see a dramatic decrease in mortality rates and disease rates. Now, as American cities continued to grow, many of the new urban dwellers came from the countryside. That was especially true in the South and most of the West. In the Northeast and the upper Midwest, however, the vast majority of the new urban residents came from overseas. So the third element in the emergence of modern America was immigration, which again was not a new phenomenon at all. But what you are starting to see between 1860 or 65, the end of the Civil War, and the beginning of the 20th century was a huge increase in the total number of immigrants arriving in the United States, but also significant changes in the patterns of immigration, both as far as the countries of origin for most immigrants and where they tended to settle once they arrived in the United States. Now, many of the 14 million immigrants who arrived in the U.S. In the last 4 decades of the 19th century came to America for the same reasons that immigrants had always come, to escape unfavorable political and economic conditions at home. But the desire of many American railroads to sell off their land holdings and the demand for cheap industrial labor as the country begins its rapid industrialization process led to publicity campaigns designed to attract even more immigrants. Prior to 1880, most immigrants to the United States were from northwestern Europe, the British Isles, Germany, Scandinavia, the Low Countries. People continued to arrive in the United States from northwestern Europe, of course, but beginning in the 1880s, the immigration pattern changed as the majority of immigrants now came from southern and eastern Europe. With a few exceptions, most immigrants were still of European origin, but increasingly they're more likely to come from Mediterranean Europe or Eastern Europe, which means, of course, they did not speak English or languages that were even closely related to English. Most were still Christians, though certainly not all, but very few were Protestant Christians. They were either Roman Catholics if they came from Italy or Poland, or Eastern Orthodox Christians if they came from Greece or Russia or Ukraine or other parts of Eastern Europe. And of course, this upset many native-born Americans. Also, earlier immigrants generally settled on farms. That was the main reason they came to America, was to acquire land. Most of the newer immigrants, however, congregated in the big industrial cities of the North and often worked as unskilled laborers or low-paid wage workers. And they tended to live in poverty. And I guess in a classic example of blaming the victim, many Americans looked at these teeming cities and all the problems that they had and put the blame on the immigrants. And so you do start to see rising nativism emerging in the 1880s, Americans calling for immigration restriction. This is sort of a running theme in American history. The first great wave of nativism, I guess, was in the 1840s and 50s when there was a call to restrict the flow of Irish immigrants into the United States. But at any rate, this is going to continue through the rest of the 19th century. And in the 1920s, it'll actually pay off from their perspective when Congress did pass severe restrictions on further immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Other Americans took a different approach to the problems of the city. Rather than calling for immigration restriction, they tried to address the problems of the working class in these teeming cities. And this, among other things, led to what is sometimes referred to as the social gospel movement, which was a movement that involved Christians, especially Protestant Christians, but also to some extent Catholics, who tried to address the worldly as well as the spiritual needs of their communities. A lot of the institutions associated with the social gospel movement originated in Great Britain because Britain had gone through the industrial process at a somewhat earlier date than the United States. And a couple of institutions associated with the social gospel movement, which are still around, are the Young Men's Christian Association, the Y, and the Salvation Army. And of course, both of those organizations provided a host of social services for working class families in these big industrial cities: recreational opportunities, educational opportunities, daycare, classes in English, and things like that. Another social gospel institution that was especially attractive to a lot of American women, and especially college-educated women, was the settlement house movement. Although her name is not widely recognized today, perhaps the most famous American woman of her time was Jane Addams. And she got heavily involved in the settlement house movement. And basically, a settlement house was a house in a slum district where middle-class college students or recent college graduates lived among the poor. And according to Jane Addams, the idea was to share the lives of the poor and to make social service express the spirit of Christ. And Addams established one of the most well-known settlement houses on Halsted Street in Chicago, and this was Hull House, which remained open until just a few years ago. Hull House maintained playgrounds, nurseries, club rooms, libraries, and kindergartens, and conducted classes in various subjects. Settlement house leaders like Addams also spoke out publicly for various reforms, such as housing laws, child labor legislation, and workmen's compensation. Another aspect of urban reform was the crusade to clean up corruption in big city government. That would prove somewhat difficult, but there was a move in that direction. And finally, there was a move toward city planning, which got a big boost from the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, the centerpiece of which was the so-called White City, and this led to a revival of interest in neoclassical architecture and also urban green spaces, as we'd call them today, urban parks. And of course, the most prominent example of that was Central Park in New York City. So, again, to recap, the emergence of modern America, three major processes: industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, so that by the beginning of the 20th century, we'd had a seismic shift in American society and culture from a predominantly rural, agricultural-based society to a predominantly urban and industrial-based society. Overall, this was good for the United States. Jobs were created, tremendous wealth was generated, but the wealth was not necessarily evenly distributed, and to a lot of rural Americans, the big cities seemed like a threat to their traditional way of life. And so next time we'll look at some of the responses to this new urban industrial society, which among other things included a revolt on the part of rural Americans, which briefly led to the formation of a new political party in the United States.